So we're now live on YouTube with the September 9th edition of the Node.js modules team. We're going to go ahead and kick it off, and I'm going to hand it off to Guy Bedford, who's going to lead the meeting today. Guy?
Thanks, Miles. Yeah, so we're going to hopefully be able to get through most of the agenda this week. The last couple of meetings, we've had a few more items than we've been able to get through. We've only got 50 minutes left for today, so let's try and keep to the time boxes on each item as much as possible. The first item on the agenda is 34718 on a pull request on the Node.js repo. This is a PR that I put together to implement a simple kind of pattern replacement in the exports field. And to reiterate the problem that this is solving, that we've discussed the last few times, is that it is quite common, or it's becoming more common, for packages to have many exports, potentially hundreds of exports. I've seen examples of packages with over 1,000 exports, and individually having entries in the exports field for each of these is not possible for these large packages. As a result, path exports become absolutely indispensable in these scenarios to be able to simply export an entire folder. But there are two problems with doing this. The first is, when you export an entire folder, you're exporting every single module in that folder, when maybe not every single module in that folder is a public module. For example, if you've done code splitting builds with Rollup, or if you've got other modules, you might end up with private modules being exported that you didn't intend to, just because you needed to export the whole folder. So that's the first problem, is you break your exports encapsulation, because it's almost just like you've turned that folder into a whole package, just like without having exports. It's just as if we don't have exports. And then the other problem is, now you need file extensions for all of those modules in the package. And we can solve both of those problems if we just treat a folder export as effectively saying, when you're using a folder export, you're allowing any subpath of the package to map into the subpath of the folder mapping. Sorry, I know it's difficult to understand without context of path exports in the exports field, but I believe most of us have that context here. And with a wildcard match, you can basically specify that the last portion of that path can then be substituted into a pattern instead. So it's just extending the existing functionality where path exports act like a wildcard already, and allowing a little bit more functionality in the pattern. So it's not actually, I would argue that it's not actually a new feature, so far as the capability is there today. The way the path exports behave is a replacement. It's just giving more flexibility to that replacement process. And I've been trying to get as much feedback as possible on the syntax, and we were looking for feedback from package authors. The issue is that not enough package authors have hit this problem, because the package authors adopting exports today maybe have packages with 5 or 6 exports at most. And these are problems we only hit far down the line. And it's a problem that came up specifically when I was working on JSPM and suddenly saw these packages with thousands of exports, and wanted to PR the exports field for them, and then realized there was no realistic way I could create an exports PR for them that would support their use cases. I do think it's important functionality. So yeah, it'd be good to hear what people are currently thinking. Jordan, I believe you had your hand up first.
Yeah, so part of the reason, I mean, I think you're right that not a lot of folks have run into it yet, partially because adding exports is a breaking change, partially because it's new, and so on. But I mean, I've expressed this a few times before, but I feel like I'm of two minds here, right? One is that if we think that things package authors want to make it easier for them to write smaller exports maps, if we think that's important, then there's a lot of features we've already decided not to do that would help with that are already hit way more often than the use case you're describing, which is still valid. So if we're going to decide to change our direction and tackle those problems, this is a clear path in that direction, and we should do that. If we're not going to change our direction, then then to me that signals that that's because the invariance that we wanted to maintain of having static export maps as much as possible are important, and we don't want to give those up. And if that's the case, then this seems like going in the wrong direction, for depending on whatever we're deciding.
Can you
like,
clarify
I do have
why you think a static replacement system is going in the wrong direction?
So we currently have the directory exports, like the things that the left-hand side ends with slash. Is that right? Or the right-hand side? I always forget how to talk about these things.
It's
the one you were talking about, the escape hatch.
It's on both sides. It ends with a trailing slash.
It would be on either side.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so the directory exports, like that's an escape hatch, right? Meaning that was not intended to be commonly used, and all those invariants that people wanted of having, like, a one-to-one mapping between exports and import maps, and like being able to not have to look at the file system to be able to generate an import map and so on. We kind of like just accepted that the directory exports as the escape hatch were this thing in the corner that messed with that, but that hopefully people wouldn't use. And I think that this feature kind of expands on that thing we hope people wouldn't use and turns it into a thing we expect people to use, which means that those concerns, one-to-one with import maps and being able to not have to look at the file system, seem like they kind of go away. And if that's the case, and we agree on that that's what the case is, then cool. Like there's other previously closed discussions that we may want to reopen. But I feel like at the moment the PR is inconsistent with our previous decisions. And then the quick little data point is I have a package that has 1,712 export specifiers without an exports field. And when I add an exports field, I intend to manually write those all out. I will probably write some tooling to help me there, but having your feature would actually help me. So I have a personal use case where I would use this PR. I just think what's more important is that the overall module system and us as a group are on the same page about priorities and directions and things like that.
Bradley?
Sure. In the PR I mentioned, there's an ordering thing which I'm concerned about, where the top level left-hand side is ordered by length and the right-hand side leaves are ordered in object iteration order. I just prefer if the top level left-hand side was object iteration order. I don't think that needs to be discussed here so much. Per other things, I highly suggest you don't put 1,700 exports entries in a package JSON. At 16,000 total entries for a policy file, that's a good 300 to 400 millisecond punishment for doing it that way. That can't be avoided because it has to be done eagerly. So for policies and things like that, we also have essentially done roughly a similar thing of scoping, and that gets you actually performance back. It also still remains completely static. So I'm not sure I understand the claim that we never want to inspect the file system, because we always eventually have to inspect the file system at runtime. So having to inspect the file system at whatever build time or creation of package JSON seems reasonable to me. I don't think any claim that this is dynamic really holds weight. It isn't dynamic to my knowledge, unless you're doing manipulation of resources at runtime within a package. And if you're concerned about that, you should probably be concerned about a lot of other features and trying to lock it down in ways besides using the exports field. So I really like this feature. It avoids some performance issues that we do see in the wild, even on small to medium-sized CLIs with policies. So I really don't want those to come and hit us with just regular package usage. That's all.
Miles?
Yeah, so a couple different thoughts here. As I've been saying in the issues, I'm kind of leaning -0 on this, not like objecting, but feeling uncomfortable. And I think that I'm starting to understand more specifically why. And I think it's more of like a syntax and like paint on the shed rather than the actual like problem that you're trying to solve here. And I'd like to suggest two potential alternatives. And, obviously we could decide not to go in that direction. But, import maps and export maps, the imports field and the exports field that we have right now are already doing a lot, but it's kind of like a one-to-one thing. And adding kind of the stars here start to feel like globs to me. And in my personal opinion, kind of like complicate what's going on. Um, with that in mind, I think that there's two potential approaches that we could take to this. One of which was suggested by Jordan before, which would be an extension map, which would be a single field where you could state the extension and the goal that it would resolve to. And like, we'd have to figure out what shorthand you would want to do for no extension, which could be like empty string or something like that, which is like not lovely. But I feel like that might scale a little bit better. The other potential solution here as well would be making a separate extension map where you give the folder and then the extension that you want resolved when no extension is given. This would be slightly more verbose, but as far as I can tell, would mostly accomplish the same basic things that this proposal is trying to present. It would still be static in the sense in the case that like there would be a single resolution for every single specifier. It would enable the patterns that you're talking about, but by kind of teasing this apart, I feel like it would be clearer to instruct people on and clearer to like reason about looking at a package JSON.
I'm not sure who had their hand up next.
I put it back up after Miles, just to suggest
Okay.
an alternative. I love the extension map thing, but the other thing is, I believe the exports field is not respected unless it's at the package level, meaning I can't put it in a subfolders package JSON. It feels like that might, since we already have to look at subfolder package JSONs anyway for type module, is it out of the question to add exports support there? Because that, then like the already existing directory nesting that packages have, like including my package that has 1700 things, like that's actually much smaller if you look at it per directory. Like I feel like the problem and potential performance issue, but also like boilerplate stuff becomes a lot easier. And this is whether Guy's PR lands or not. And similarly, like if an extension map landed and that was also in any package JSON, then it would be kind of a similar thing in my mind. Is that out of the question, like to make it be any folder and not just package level?
I've previously objected to this, and I can be a bit more concrete as to reasons why. Right now, exports applies to bare specifiers. It isn't really that it applies to any specific folder, it's only to these specific specifiers that we use it in. If we apply it to all specifiers, it becomes immensely complex. In a very old RFC on, I think it was in the Node EPs repository, we tried to discuss a consumer and author negotiation system. It's a two-phase commit if we do that. And that's slow, and figuring out how to make it not slow or complex is hard. Because it would suddenly apply to any relative specifier. And if you resolve something, it could resolve to a location that resolves outside of another thing.
So I'm not
and then you
actually
have to do it
talking about a
again.
relative specifier. I'm just talking about anything underneath the bare specifier.
That would require the specific directory structure, which is what exports is trying to avoid requiring.
Okay.
So
yeah, I guess
this
I'm envisioning
PR,
like the parent using the directory /exports to point to a directory, but then a subdirectory, but then that subdirectory having its own package JSON and being able to then, so like that the parent can delegate down.
I think we've discussed this
child.
before, and there are technical reasons why it just doesn't work, because
Okay.
like you could then get conflicts between like the parent not exporting something but the child would, and like it gets really messy really fast.
Yeah, if it's a
But yeah,
technical mess, then we don't have to argue about like should we do it, because we can't. So no, that's fine. Thank you.
So I had just two thoughts. One was am I up? Sorry. I had two thoughts. One was I kind of feel like Miles, I'm like maybe minus 0 on this, just because like the more complex exports gets, I feel like the harder it is then for bundlers and other tools to like mimic how it works, as I'm sure Jordan could talk about. So I'm a little concerned about that, but not so much so that like if this really, improves a lot of people, then sure, we should add it, and then the complexity is worth it. The other thing I would say is I don't think this is just for extensions. Like this isn't just so that I can have lots of paths without extensions. It's also any type of mapping. Like if I have, a /dist folder, and inside there I've got, 500 files that follow some format, I might want to do like left-hand side star.js, right-hand side, ./dist/star.js or something like that. And, that wouldn't, like an extension map wouldn't help with that. That would only help me like get rid of extensions. So I think that the goals of this are broader than just, getting rid of extensions. It's more along the lines of making whatever kind of pretty specifier you're aiming for.
Bradley, did you still have something to add?
I'm dealing with it, kid. Just skip it.
Okay. Miles, did you still have your hand up?
I did not. I guess I would love if you have anything to add, and maybe it's the misunderstanding of the feature, because it seems like Jeff was suggesting that like a left hand to right hand map could allow you to map specific file extensions on the left to other file extensions on the right, which was not something that really like stuck with me in reviewing the proposal as a capability. So I'd love just like clarification about why one or either of the proposals that I suggested may not be sufficient, and why it's beyond simply just an extension map, which is what I mostly saw the proposal as.
Right. So good questions. So firstly, it doesn't permit mapping and I guess, look, so the way to think about it is exports. The exports field provides a virtualization of the package. You're creating a sort of a virtualized view of the file system. And this was enabled the moment that we made exports not just a listing of the public files in the package, but a custom mapping of those specifiers. And the moment we did that, exports was no longer just, hey, only these files are exported, like an array of list of them. It became an actual mapping system, and so a virtualization space. And to speak to Jeffrey's case, one example of a sort of a mapping that would be larger than just a file extension mapping could be something like, say you have a pattern where you have like a components folder, and in the components folder you have a naming system like you call each component like node component.js, and then you have also like browser component.js. So if you wanted a mapping for that, one mapping could be like components star maps to, sorry, I'm just writing it out. It'll appear shortly. So I just want to give an example of how you can actually use it to, firstly, how it can work well with conditional exports, and then also how the naming actually can be more than just extensions. So there's an example of a mapping where you have a naming scheme for your node builds and your browser builds, and you're mapping into that naming scheme and doing an extension system and doing conditional mapping. So you're getting a different mapping depending on the environment. So that's an example of how these things kind of play together. So you're getting compatibility with conditional exports and compatibility with custom naming schemes, either with conditional exports or otherwise. I mean, we could have called it node-component name without it being a conditional export as well. But just to give an idea. So you can get these kind of other types of use cases out of it. Does that answer?
It also, expanding on what Guy said, we do have a variety of packages internally at GoDaddy, which do have similar conventions, where we have directories for components, and they each are named after the kind of component that they are, and they contain an index file in them. So it's not just being able to point directly to files. In particular, it is interesting to us to point to a directory and then to the index file within it. And that would still support things like what Guy was saying. With this proposal, it would still allow us to have specific React Native in particular conditions that would reroute.
In terms of the sort of static dynamic question, what's worth bearing in mind is when you guys in the past spoken about a completely static mapping based on configuration, that is maintained by this. All you need is the configuration and the specifier, and you can work out what it's going to map into. You don't have to look at the file system. You don't need to stat anything. You don't need to read anything else. You don't need to read another, see if any file exists. You don't need to see if a package JSON exists. With just the configuration and the original package specifier, you know, okay, it's definitely going to be this file within the package that's being loaded. So it's a direct static mapping. If you want to work out the full list of what the package exports, yes, you then have to glob the file system to see what matches those patterns. But it's the same for folder exports today, if you want to see all the things that are exported in folders.
So I guess a request that I could make here, I think seeing these specific use cases that both Guy and Brad have brought do make me feel a little bit more comfortable. I still have like just complexity and magic in general makes me queasy, although I see this as more complexity than magic with these specific examples. I'll review the pull request again, and I'm going to make a request right now, which may already be there. So apologies, but I think documenting these use cases, potentially even having a couple of example repos that show like the file structure and explain like how it would be consumed, would be very useful here, not just for kind of teaching the complexity, but also for like kind of instilling some best practices about how to use this. I guess one question that I do have, I have to dig up the pull request again, but there was a comment. Let me see if I can dig it up here from Sakra. And in particular, he was asking about the relationship. Oh God, that was the wrong copy paste. 1 second here, I pressed the wrong button. Here we go. So is from Sakra from about a week ago. I would favor this feature instead of directory export ending with / since it does not require dynamic resolving based on directory content. It'd be cool to deprecate directory exports in favor of wildcard exports. Guy and Brad as the two who seem to be the most bullish on this feature. How do you feel about that particular request? It does seem like something that folks from the tooling ecosystem would be +1 on.
I personally don't
yeah.
use directory exports, so no opinion.
Some very large packages do though.
That's the thing. The biggest issue is that it could be a breaking change. What we could possibly do is effectively do a soft deprecation of directory exports and say it's encouraged to do an wildcard, then do a process of next major introducing explicit warning, major finally deprecating. But I don't think we can realistically remove it at this point.
We could do a runtime deprecation, like printing a warning in 15 and remove it in 16.
It might be an option. The other concern there is that if an old package is published, you can't expect a package to change. Like that's a lot of the problem with this stuff. And then you end up with, back to that old story of pages of warnings just because you happen to be using some old packages. But I think as a rule, like in the Node.js ecosystem, just because a package hasn't updated in a year doesn't mean that you should get a page of warnings just for using it. And so that would be my concern with trying to push something out there too quickly. To be honest,
Yeah,
the direct wildcard is equivalent to a directory export. I don't think a directory export is doing any harm. If you effectively undocument it and just move on as if it doesn't exist, and then eventually one day it could be removed.
I mean, we could do a doc deprecation as well. Follow like I just think the general way we've done things in Node, and we could do this for 15, is we could introduce a runtime warning in 15, and if people get pissed enough, we remove it. But if we land this wildcard feature prior, I think adoption is still early enough that may be something that we can actually do.
We should, since we've got well-defined package scopes, maybe it's time to start thinking about having warnings that only apply to local code versus Node modules code. Because if we can do that, then you could say, hey, your local package is doing this, you should fix it, and it's definitely your code, so you can do it.
Yeah, and we have prior
that
art.
could help other things.
We have prior art for that as well, with the buffer deprecation. So we could always just put like a package scoped deprecation warning for using directories with slashes, and we could leave that for a very long time. But it at least would make it really annoying for the package authors, and then they would have an alternative that they could use. The other thing that Sakra asked for was potentially a different symbol rather than star, because it might be confused with globs. And I'll be honest, like I have had a hard time thinking of this proposal not as globs. So I don't know if that's intentional or not.
Well, another thought is like, as when some of the examples were being mentioned before, like what happens if you want more than one replacement? Like if your pattern is slightly more complex than a single wildcard. So I'm wondering if there's something we could come up with that would sort of work with that. where you put like, where there's some way to say like, this is an explicit replacement, and then like reference that explicit replacement on the other side.
That sounds dangerously like we would be putting a regular expression engine with capture
Yeah,
groups in.
I agree. It dangerously sounds like that. But I mean, that's sort of what stars already are.
The thing is, like, so many symbols are existing symbols. Like, if you want to start doing like $1, $2 patterns and stuff, like, then what happens when you clash with a file name that uses it? And what's nice about star is you have no clashes, and it's relatively simple.
I mean, you could imagine instead of a string, you have an array, and every segment in the array is a star implied. So you just put your chunks, and I don't know, you can come up with something that's more than just a string, and like it would be harder to figure out, but it would not be regexy. I don't know if that's better or not, but like there is paths there.
Yeah, I'm completely open to these kinds of suggestions. I mean, as said in the original PR, like, I'm open to semantic changes. Maybe if people want to pick up these discussions in the PR itself, we can continue to work through some of these technical details.
Okay, so I think maybe that seems good to me. I think like the one thing, or the two things that we need to consider here from a timing perspective, though, the December major cutoff for Node 15 is coming up in a couple weeks. So I think that if we want to land this, and if we wish to do a runtime deprecation of Slash, we need to do the runtime deprecation before the December major cutoff. Probably we could maybe like, and I can ask the release and LTS, the release and TSC about this, because it's an experimental API. We may be able to like kind of fudge the dates on that a bit, but at the very least, like, I think if we want to do all these things, we really should be getting them into 15 as soon as possible, and potentially even trying to get it onto 14 before 14 goes to LTS. And a step further, depending, although this we may just decide, hey, we're not really there for 12. 12's about to go into maintenance mode. So we're about to miss the train on being able to make any large changes to 12 at all, which might be fine, but it's worth being aware of that. And I guess Guy, to you, to like kind of speed this up, I think that a plan that includes at the very least a doc, but potentially a runtime deprecation to the directories, consensus around the wildcard, and slightly more in-depth documentation of like example use cases would flip my bit from like a -0 to a +0, and perhaps even a +1.
Great. I'll follow up on those. All right, we've already used up most of our time. The next one is another issue we have discussed in the past few meetings repeatedly, the package.json file resolution. Has there been any progress on that? Does anyone want to discuss this?
I think that we have like a decently scoped idea of what an API there could be. We just haven't done the work. And I think like, I guess one of the things there also, and maybe we could dig into this a bit more, is like, while some people have been frustrated by this, have not, like, it's kind of, it flared up and then it was chill. And then it kind of like flares up when someone new realizes that it's a pain and a package breaks. And then like the package adds package JSON to the export map, and then people forget about it until the next time it breaks someone. So I don't know if people are like super clamoring for this API. Jordan, I know you had some specific thoughts on it. Please let me know if you think I mischaracterized it there.
Sorry, I was trying to pull up the notes doc and got distracted. You're talking about this is the module package dir thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the more that people add exports fields to their packages, the more this is going to become a problem. And it would be, I know the timing is pretty short, but it would be really nice to be able to get it into 14 before LTS. You know, obviously it can be added later because it's minor.
So it could
That's true.
Added, yeah.
Yeah, so I guess that's a good point. So there's not actually a time crunch on it. But yeah, I think that the sooner we can get it into 14, the better. It, you know, would even be nice to be able to backport it to 12. I don't know what the timing is for that, but I think there's a little while left there.
By it, I assume you're meaning this new API that's like
Yeah.
get package root or whatever we call it.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
Just the farther back it's backported, the easier it is to encourage tooling authors to use it, which then like obsoletes the whole question about how do I get to the package JSON if the package didn't already explicitly export it. Yeah.
The only breakage here is actually in order to prevent people from grabbing your package JSON. You have to now set it to an invalid value.
But you already can't prevent it. You just like
With
unless you intercept
exports.
the file system calls.
Well,
Like I can still
that's
guess
what
it. I can
package
still apply
exports
heuristics.
covers. I mean, they can
But the
already
intention-
get to it with the file system. This is like this, you can't argue both sides.
Well,
That-
it's the issue is that exports is not intended to provide a security mechanism. It's because you can still get to everything. And in this case, by not having package JSON and exports, it's not part of your API, and thus the goal is achieved. The intention is not to prevent someone from getting the package JSON.
Yeah, but if somebody doesn't want it to be considered part of their public API, they can still remove using import or required to get a hold of it.
Correct, and this will not change that. This API does not give you the package JSON contents as currently discussed. It gives you, I mean, we could do that, but I believe the intention at the moment is to have it give you the path to the directory that contains the package JSON. And then it's still up to you to use file system methods to get to it. You still wouldn't be able to use require or import.
Okay, never mind.
I guess that is only partially true. I believe,
Okay.
but I could be wrong, that if you use require and the full path to the file, that's using a relative path that's never hitting the package exports resolution algorithm, there would be no way to prevent that.
Yes,
currently.
this would
I
only
think maybe
apply
that
to
was what Brad is
bear.
talking about.
Yeah.
Okay,
this
but that's, I mean,
exports only.
that's always true then for any path that isn't in exports, but is requireable. Once you get the path to the file, then you can require it by not using the bear identifier. So
Yes.
But perhaps the challenge here then would be the kind of API that we're talking about is a convenience API to allow people to break the API contract of modules would be kind of the only reason to ever use it.
To my knowledge, yes, but we already have people in the ecosystem doing that, and package exports are only scoped to bear specifiers. We shouldn't be trying to expand their scope in this PR.
Right.
So to be clear, I was actually not advocating for expanding the scope. I was perhaps advocating that not having this API is actually okay because it forces people to do a little bit extra work to break that API contract. But I guess for things like APMs, this is actually something they need to do. So
right. Well,
that's how I
for
feel about it.
All the for all the bundlers that need resolution tools, you need to be able to read package JSON to do what Node does and resolve it. And on top of that, it's like you could argue anything is part of the API contract, but I think that if you have an exports field and something's not in that field, it is explicitly not part of the API contract. And even I, who still supports Node 0.6, would not consider anything breaking if it messed with something outside of that exports field.
I guess
so,
what I would say though is I'm not 100% convinced, and I'm not saying we shouldn't make this API, but I'm not 100% convinced that this is not 100% doable in userland via a module like resolve. If all we're talking about is like, hey, if I have a dependency that's in my package JSON, that's a top level dependency, the root folder will literally always be node modules / that folder relative to the file at which I've required it from or imported it from. So like,
Yeah, even if it's nested, it would be in a
yeah,
node modules folder. Yeah.
and we'd be guaranteed that it would be at the top level. So like, I'm not 100% convinced that like we need this API inside of core, because it's not like such a complex thing that you need internal access to the runtime to figure it out reliably and consistently.
I mean, so that's a fair point, and perhaps it would be possible then to write a userland module to do this. I think that the benefit here, though, isn't just we're not trying to give a capability to tooling. What we're trying to do is get userland adoption, because we don't want package authors to feel pressured to include package JSON in their exports, nor do we want like them to feel pressured to not use exports at all. Like we want maximum compatibility between the tooling ecosystem and the package authors and the users of, so the users of all those things are happy. And like sure, I given what you're saying, I could probably write a package and publish it, and we could try and like, whenever someone complains, we could try and advocate that they use my package. But like that, people are a lot less willing to add a dependency or to add a dependency that has a single maintainer and so on, like, than they are to just use something that's in Node Core. And I think that in this case, the goal is not restricting the capability. The goal is adopting it so that we can keep exports clean of package JSON. So like, so I hear you. Maybe it is not a like capability that Node must add, but it seems like an API that gets maximum effect by Node blessing it by putting it in core.
So an API that I can imagine Node would maybe have that could be useful for building these tools. And Brad, you can tell me, like, because I'm trying to remember on ESM that maybe something like this doesn't totally make sense, but like the concept of package root. So it's like when we go and resolve to figure out where the node modules folder is, that's always going to be resolving up until we find the folder that has the node modules folder. And that's like essentially like the package root package that you are in could give you kind of like the base URL or path that you use to kind of reliably then get everything else.
So that's not true for CommonJS, unfortunately.
Interject, we likely only have time for one more item on the agenda. We try and wrap this one up within the next minute or so.
Let's just move this one to the issue. I think it's just a fun one to noodle on, but we don't need a solution today. Apologies.
No, please reach the end of this current discussion. If you still had anything.
I just don't think we'll reach a conclusion right now. It's like we can try to make an API and then debate it in a PR. No one's jumping to do it right now. So I think it's just like someone needs to do the work, and then we can debate if we want to.
I'm happy to do the work. I just have to find the time for it.
Okay. Yeah, I'd just like to get to this next item quickly while we still have time, because it's an important one. The exports detection for CommonJS. I've updated the PR to support the patterns for star exports. And we also had an out-of-band meeting with Gus, where he basically said that he would be happy if we could get 95% of packages supporting the correct set of named exports within whatever we decide should, so whatever we decide should be the support criteria, as it were, that within that criteria we should get 95%. And for packages, by restricting to packages that are exporting the ES module flag, so predominantly transpiled modules, and then with the new work on export support, I managed to get the support on the test packages that Jeffrey was running from about 89% to, I believe, around 95%. We still need to confirm the exact numbers, which seems like it will actually solve Gauss's block to me. So I think it looks likely that we have overcome his block. We still need to get final confirmation on that. But assuming that we can move towards that out of band, does anyone have any other thoughts on this named exports problem? Any other concerns? Or would people be okay for it to land between meetings? Does anyone have any questions about the approach, the implementation, the details of the ground? No one?
My internet cut out and I actually missed your question. Apologies.
I was just saying, does anyone have any further clarifications, feedback, questions, points for, points against, or is this something that we want to continue outside of the meeting process and separately move towards merging?
I guess I could add a statement of support. I think the way in which right now we have scoped to modules that have metadata in them that explicitly imply that they are transpiled modules that were like meant to target multiple environments, makes me feel a lot more comfortable about it. It unlocks use cases that we hadn't talked about before, about essentially being able to support named exports from a UMD module, which is a very valid format to want to publish in if you want to be able to have a single output file support multiple runtimes. I think that if we can hit that level of 95% with those heuristics, I'm personally in support of landing this, and it also doesn't mean that we don't continue to do research about other ways to continue to improve this. Node is a project that improves things all the time. I think that this is a very nice carve out and scope that improves the status quo and potentially also supports a lot of existing transpiled modules on NPM that may or may not actually get updated in a very accurate way.
So I just wanted to clarify, if I currently am importing default from one of these modules, what happens when this PR lands?
So what we're currently discussing is that it'll continue to behave exactly the same. And this is a divergence from transpilers, because transpilers will expect that default to be the default export or undefined if there was nothing. But we are specifically discussing maintaining this invariant.
Okay.
Bradley?
I just want to state that that seems reasonable to me. It means that using this isn't a breaking change. Also, I just am skeptical that a lot of packages are mixing default and named exports. And if you are doing default with transpilers, it already is very confusing and you have to use .default sometimes. So, yeah.
I guess like one thing that we could maybe do there potentially would be in the cases of like a default conflict. Like the example I would give would be a transpiled module has a default export, but we're exporting the namespace. Maybe we could give a clear warning, potentially scoped to the package, that like, hey, we've done this because for legacy purposes of how Node works, but it's possible, but like the package that you're importing has a named default, that you may not be getting exactly what you're expecting.
I'm very wary of that. So if you look in the wild, a lot of people make a transpiler output that has the default export explicitly point to the namespace, on purpose to get other tools to work with it. It's frequent enough that I know it's in the wild. So I think a warning would just be too common.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I've definitely done that as well, where I essentially manually make the default what would be module exports for like legacy purposes. And yeah, I could see that causing a ton of false positives there.
So just to talk about the kind of practical process to land, there's a few things that need to be done. I tried to embed it as native code. Unfortunately, the native changes, because they were sort of binary breaking, it was too much. It seemed like a lot of overhead, and in addition, the C code needed a lot of refactoring. So what I actually decided to do is rewrite the parser in JavaScript, but that's going to take about a day of work. We also need to finalize the metrics and the numbers, and then move towards getting direct approval from Gus. And so it's still going to be a little bit of a process, but I guess the main thing is just if we continue to make those steps, that we have the support of the group, and if anyone has any remaining concerns to say now. Otherwise, we will continue to try and move this forward in the PR and move towards landing it if we can.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're past time and I got to drop. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the YouTube stream. And then if y'all want to keep going,